Over 100 oil tankers surge toward the United States. Washington reconfigures global energy flows amid the Iran crisis. The United States has accused China of exploiting the crisis to stockpile oil, raising concerns about its strategic reliability. As the Strait of Hormuz approaches functional paralysis, Washington has executed a dual-track strategic move, tightening pressure on Iran while quietly reshaping global energy flows. The key question is whether this is a reactive measure to crisis dynamics or a premeditated effort to recalibrate the balance of power. On April 14, 2026, the White House confirmed a pivotal development. More than 100 empty oil tankers are now converging on U.S. ports to load cargo. This is not merely a commercial shift. It signals that Washington is leveraging the Iran crisis to restructure global energy distribution as transit through the Strait of Hormuz faces severe disruption. Notably, 54 of these vessels are very large crude carriers, VLCCs, each capable of transporting approximately 2 million barrels of oil. The scale reflects a sharp surge in demand for U.S. supply, not only to offset immediate shortfalls, but to rebuild supply chains historically anchored in the Middle East. At its core, this represents a strategic-level energy logistics realignment. As traditional transit corridors constrict under conflict pressure and enforcement measures targeting Iran's export infrastructure, the market is being forced to pivot toward more stable suppliers, with the United States emerging as a central alternative hub. Donald Trump has repeatedly emphasized that this wave of tankers is converging on what he calls the highest quality energy supply in the world. The message is not purely economic. It carries strategic signaling. Washington is positioning itself as a central guarantor of global energy security, with the capacity to mobilize supply rapidly, flexibly, and at scale during periods of instability. Taken together, these developments indicate that the United States is not merely reacting to crisis conditions. It is actively exploiting them to consolidate control over the global energy map. The sharp surge in tanker traffic toward U.S. ports is not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a coordinated military maritime campaign. Following the collapse of ceasefire efforts, President Donald Trump authorized a selective blockade of Iranian ports, an instrument designed to directly degrade Tehran's energy export capacity, while neutralizing the use of the Strait of Hormuz as a tool of strategic leverage. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of global oil supply transits, is now experiencing an unprecedented drop in traffic. Shipping data indicates that daily vessel throughput has fallen from over 100 transits to a fraction of that level, reflecting the immediate impact of enforcement measures and the sharply elevated risk environment across the operational theater. At the operational level, U.S. Central Command, United States Central Command CENTCOM, has executed a streamlined action package, line countermeasures, maritime domain control, and the establishment of secure shipping corridors. The objective is conditional freedom of navigation, allowing non-Iran-linked vessels to transit while isolating Tehran's import-export routes without fully shutting down international traffic. The strategic effects are now evident. Global tanker fleets are being forced to reroute toward U.S. Gulf Coast ports to access alternative supply. This is not merely a market reaction, but a structural realignment of global energy logistics, with the United States emerging as a central hub, leveraging record domestic output. Collectively, Washington is applying a synchronized military-economic approach to reshape the energy balance, constraining adversary revenue streams while maximizing its own export capacity amid global instability. As security risks escalate across the Middle East, international tanker operators are executing large-scale rerouting, both to mitigate operational risk and to capitalize on abundant U.S. supply. The result is a rapidly accelerating wave of U.S. energy exports delivering a dual effect, offsetting global supply gaps while generating substantial revenue for the domestic oil and gas sector. This demonstrates Washington's ability to convert its production advantage into geo-economic leverage amid market volatility. From a strategic standpoint, the White House has positioned U.S. output as a lifeline for global markets. Donald Trump has gone further, urging supply-constrained nations to redirect tankers toward the United States, signaling intent to steer trade flows, not merely offer economic guidance. At the operational level, shipping analysts report that multiple fleets preemptively adjusted routes in anticipation of tighter controls and rising security risks across the Middle East. Even under selective enforcement, market psychology, combined with elevated risk premiums, has been sufficient to significantly suppress regional traffic. At the strategic level, these dynamics reinforce the U.S. role as a global energy hub, while opening the door to a near-term restructuring of oil trade patterns. As states recalibrate sourcing strategies, the global energy balance is shifting toward more stable supply centers, with the United States at the core of that transition. Donald Trump. U.S.-Iran talks could resume within 48 hours. On April 14th, President Donald Trump signaled that Washington and Tehran could resume negotiations within 48 hours, likely again in Islamabad. If confirmed, this would mark a second round following a fragile ceasefire framework. Oil prices declined the same day, as renewed diplomatic expectations eased concerns over prolonged global supply disruption. The initial talks in Islamabad over the weekend failed to produce a breakthrough, with Iran rejecting key U.S. demands, particularly on its nuclear program. In response, Trump authorized tighter maritime measures targeting Iran, while keeping limited diplomatic channels open. In remarks to the New York Post, Trump hinted at a rapid restart. Stay in Islamabad. Something could happen within 2 days. The statement underscores a dual-track approach, sustained strategic pressure alongside a maintained path to negotiations. Notably, Donald Trump praised Pakistan's mediation role, particularly General Asim Munir, who has been directly coordinating back-channel communications between the two sides. In recent weeks, Pakistan has emerged as a key diplomatic hub, hosting multiple high-level exchanges aimed at de-escalating U.S.-Iran tensions. He's done an excellent job, so there's a strong chance we'll return there, Trump noted, signaling Islamabad as the preferred venue rather than seeking a new intermediary. A White House official told CNBC on April 14th that Washington and Tehran are actively discussing a second round of talks, though no fixed timeline has been set. Parallel reporting indicates both sides are moving closer to reactivating dialogue channels after a period of disruption. The same day, Reuters cited Pakistani and Iranian officials suggesting delegations are likely to reconvene in Islamabad. An Iranian embassy source noted the next round could occur by late weekend or early next week, pending final confirmation. From the intermediary side, a senior Pakistan official confirmed Islamabad has proactively re-engaged Iran and received positive signals. Tehran is prepared to enter a second round, the source noted, indicating diplomatic momentum remains intact. Regional sources add that Pakistan is now coordinating timelines between both sides, with parallel engagements aimed at locking in a viable window. A near-term meeting, potentially as early as this weekend, remains under active consideration, contingent on political and security conditions. A day earlier, Donald Trump also signaled openness to restarting talks. Speaking outside the Oval Office, he acknowledged negotiations had stalled over the nuclear issue. However, according to the White House, Iran initiated contact on Monday morning, expressing intent to resume dialogue and move toward a deal. "I can say the other side called us, the right people, the right channels, and they genuinely want an agreement," Trump stated, underscoring Washington's diplomatic initiative while pointing to a potential shift in trajectory following recent escalation. In parallel, Donald Trump publicly criticized European allies, arguing they have failed to deliver substantive action in addressing the Strait of Hormuz crisis. "They just meet and meet. They want results but don't know how to achieve them," he stated, reportedly describing Europe's approach as that of a paper tiger. Alongside the Iran track, Washington is expanding its diplomatic footprint across the Middle East. On the same day, under U.S. coordination, envoys from Israel and Lebanon held direct talks at the U.S. State Department, the first such engagement since 1993. The development is viewed as a potential inflection point, reflecting efforts to open parallel dialogue channels and reduce regional pressure. Secretary of State Marco Rubio described the meeting as historic, noting it could serve as an initial foundation for a broader negotiation framework aimed at a long-term peace arrangement between the two countries. The United States has accused China of exploiting the crisis to stockpile oil. raising concerns about its strategic reliability. On April 14th, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent issued a sharp critique, stating that amid escalating tensions linked to Iran, Beijing has not contributed to stabilizing transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, it has moved to increase oil reserves and tighten exports of select strategic goods. He argued this reflects a familiar pattern seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, where China prioritizes resource accumulation during global volatility. Speaking at an event hosted by the Institute of International Finance in Washington, Bessent said that over the past 5 years, China has repeatedly acted as an unreliable partner in times of crisis, prioritizing strategic interest over systemic stability. He also confirmed direct discussions with Chinese officials on Tuesday, indicating the issue has moved beyond rhetoric into formal diplomatic channels. However, when asked whether the dispute would affect a potential visit by Donald Trump to China, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent declined to give a direct answer. He emphasized that working-level ties between Trump and Xi Jinping remain stable, with high-level channels playing a key role in managing differences. "I see the visit as a signal of stability. The relationship has been managed top-down," he said, stressing that dialogue remains essential to prevent escalation and maintain balance in U.S.-China relations amid rising geopolitical complexity. Despite this, Bessent's hardline stance persists. He reiterated that over the past 5 years, China has repeatedly demonstrated limited strategic reliability, from stockpiling medical supplies during COVID-19 to recent moves restricting rare earth exports. He added that as global energy markets face pressure from disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, China has continued to expand oil reserves at scale rather than easing supply tensions. "They keep building reserves while cutting exports," he noted, signaling Beijing's prioritization of domestic interests over systemic stability. Notably, China already holds one of the world's largest strategic petroleum reserves, reportedly comparable to the combined stockpiles of the 32 member states of the International Energy Agency. Continued accumulation amid supply scarcity is therefore raising concerns about potential market distortion. At the same time, institutions including the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and the International Energy Agency have jointly urged countries to avoid large-scale stockpiling or export controls, warning such measures could intensify what is already seen as one of the most severe supply shocks in energy market history. While not naming specific actors, the warning is widely interpreted as targeting behavior that amplifies systemic instability. These developments unfold against escalating U.S.-Iran tensions following the collapse of nuclear talks in February. Donald Trump subsequently authorized a coordinated military campaign with Israel in late February to counter Tehran's nuclear threat. In response, Iran imposed control measures in the Strait of Hormuz, driving oil prices up by as much as 50% at peak and severely disrupting global supply chains. As a critical energy choke point, the Strait of Hormuz still carries roughly 1/5 of global oil and gas flows. Any prolonged disruption could trigger cascading effects worldwide, impacting not only energy prices, but also economic stability and strategic security. Donald Trump has called on affected nations to deploy naval forces to the Middle East to secure this vital corridor, explicitly highlighting China's role. He argued Beijing has a direct stake in regional stability, given its heavy reliance on energy shipments transiting Hormuz. Meanwhile, U.S. maritime enforcement measures are entering a tighter phase. In the early stage, a China-linked tanker, Rich Starry, was still able to pass through controlled waters. However, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has since stated that Washington will not allow similar cases to recur. Speaking on the sidelines of meetings hosted by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that vessels linked to Iran-related oil transport will be fully denied passage. "Those ships will no longer be allowed through. They will not be able to access their oil," he said, underscoring a hardening U.S. stance on energy supply chains tied to Iran. When pressed on ships that have paid transit fees to Tehran, Bessent was unequivocal: "You will not be permitted to pass." He warned that any state or entity facilitating such payments could be deemed in violation of U.S. sanctions and face serious economic and legal consequences. Operationally, Washington maintains that maritime enforcement is being executed at high intensity and with tangible impact. The blockade took effect at 10 a.m. Monday, though early tracking data showed limited exceptions, with some vessels departing Iranian ports and transiting the Strait of Hormuz during initial implementation. According to Agence France-Presse, the bulk carrier Christiana and tanker Elpis exited the area within hours of enforcement beginning. However, United States Central Command CENTCOM quickly rejected any notion of control gaps, asserting that within 24 hours of full operational deployment, no vessels departing Iranian ports were able to breach U.S. monitoring. At least 6 commercial ships were reportedly forced to reroute under U.S. directives, returning to ports along the Gulf of Oman. The U.S. has now deployed a large-scale force package, over 10,000 personnel across naval, marine, and air units, supported by more than a dozen warships and dozens of aircraft, to establish comprehensive control over maritime activity linked to Iran. Surveillance extends beyond major ports to the entire coastline spanning the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman, forming a layered control architecture. At the same time, Washington continues to emphasize conditional freedom of navigation. Vessels not linked to Iran are permitted to transit the Strait of Hormuz, provided they comply with enforcement protocols. This underscores a selective containment strategy, isolating Iran-related energy flows while preserving the continuity of global trade. As global energy flows shift, decisions made now may redefine the balance of power for years to come. Is Washington stabilizing the system or accelerating a new cycle of escalation?